to Just Energy Radio with Dr. Rita Louise.
Hello and welcome back to Just Energy Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and thank you all for staying tuned to the second hour of the show. A couple of quick announcements. Don't forget, my new book, Man-Made, The Chronicles of Our Extraterrestrial Gods, is now available and for sale. You can get copies at www.manmadethechronicles.com. We are offering a pre-release offer where we're shipping the books out for free, signed and autographed by myself and my co-author, Wayne LaLiberty. Also, I'm very excited. If you want to learn more about the book or hang out with me even more, I'm going to be on Coast to Coast AM with George Norrie this coming Monday. So let's see. So let me get David and Tom back on. David's website is spinvestigations.org. Tom's website is www.cosmicveil.com. Guys, so before the break, we were talking about the nature of energy and about it being not really, or that there needed to be a physical component to it. But where I kind of get a little lost personally is what about, because this is coming from my world, about like thoughts and emotions. There's not anything in my mind tangible about them. However, from and I love your word, Tom, information perspective, I can tap into that any day of the week working with my clients.
Absolutely. This was one of the points that I was trying to make. Before we went on break, I was talking about remote viewing. And I was talking about that this function still occurs inside of a Faraday cage, which is designed to specifically block out all types of energy inputs from reaching inside of that environment where that cage is surrounding, which means that the information is coming to the remote viewer from that remote location outside of the normal limitations of space and time. In other words, you're talking about a distance of a couple thousand miles. There is no broadcast wave, an electromagnetic wave that's broadcasting that information to the recipient. There's no light beam, there's no electrical wire, there's no optical fiber connecting the two locations. And yet that information comes down in the human brain and materializes into a form of physical reality, which means that the very same information that the remote viewer is seeing is the same information from which the remote site is assembled, and it is being stored and conveyed in a way that is outside of local physical space-time.
But I'm going to put something out there. From my work, it's not as much about receiving. When you're talking about something like remote viewing, it's more about creating that little wormhole to go look at it. You putting it out there so you can use your little feelers to touch and feel and look and interact, as opposed to just saying, oh, come to me.
I think it has to do, too, with entanglement. I think you are literally, you have an instantaneous connection to two different points based on entanglement. I believe that as human beings, we're all entangled, both with the universe, with ourselves, and with each other. And there are times when that manifestation becomes painfully clear, and sometimes pleasantly clear. Just depending on the circumstances. But I'm a total believer that everything is interwoven into a fabric that's common to all. And I think remote viewers are merely tapping into that entanglement and utilizing it. And I also think that sort of skill set isn't something you're born with. I think it's an extension of intuition. I think it's the ability to take your intuition and develop it into a much stronger manifestation. And on the other hand, I think mediumship is something you're born with. So I think psychic ability is something that everybody has and can develop to a certain degree based on intuition. But I think mediumship is something very unique and different because the mechanics of how the two operate are completely different.
No, I'll agree with that. I think with mediumship in particular, there has to be a certain level of openness to receiving on that level, one that I'm not personally comfortable with, which is why I'm not a medium.
Even more than that. I mean, it's an established note that people with medium capabilities have much higher levels of serum magnetite in their brains. Serum magnetite is the condition that allows birds to migrate to the same nest that they were born in to lay their eggs. It allows salmon to swim upstream to the exact place they were born to lay their eggs. It is a condition in the brain that allows enhanced perception. And they are born with that chemical makeup. And interestingly, I believe it's also genetic in nature. And in most cases, it seems to be a very recessive gene, and where it skips a generation. In other words, rarely is there a mother-daughter team or a father-son team or a father-daughter team. There's generally a grandmother-granddaughter connection or a grandfather-grandson connection. It generally skips a generation between manifestations. And that's not to say that each generation doesn't have some aspect of the gift. It's generally not fully developed each generation. It generally skips a generation to have fully development. At least statistically, that seems to be what we're seeing when we're interviewing these different people and checking into their past. One of the things we're doing now is we're studying the whole manifestation of fibromyalgia in mediums. And, you know, the fact that fibromyalgia only strikes 2% of the general population, but it affects 80% of the medium population, tends to make us think that there's a correlation between the two. So we do a little survey with mediums, and we talk about, you know, their history, their family history, and a lot of interesting statistics are coming out of this. But I find the whole thing very fascinating because most of these people are very empathic, and I think much of the symptoms that they suffer for are not their own. They are symptoms that they are getting from getting like out of phase energy with their own energy. I think when you take on energy from a foreign source, which is what mediums do when they do their thing, if that energy is in phase with your own biofield, then it's very positive and you have a very good experience with it. But if it's out of phase with your biofield, then it cancels out your own emanations. It can cause sickness. It can cause headaches. It can cause sleep disorders. It can cause you to have pain. It can cause you to have back pain. It can cause you to have all sorts of things. So it's a crapshoot when you go to do a reading, because if the energy is in phase with your own, you're going to have a very good experience. And if it's not, you're going to have a very bad experience. And we're working on right now coming up with therapies that are non-traditional, non-medical therapies to ease some of these symptoms, and we're having some success in doing that.
Well, we're going to have to just make a whole show on that because that's really interesting, but kind of outside the scope of our topic today. Sound okay,
That's
David?
True. But my point is that it's all connected with this information.
Well, yeah.
I agree. The way I look at it is this. Sometimes we get so buried into details that when we do that, it seems that everything is kind of a disparate discipline. It's kind of its own avenue or road. One of the examples that I talk about of all the myriads of events and manifestations on the planet Earth, and all the tons of disciplines that we have to study all these details, only from a perspective far out in space can we actually see that what the Earth is a wet, dirty ball that is infected with mold and microbes. And they're all in one world. And they all interrelate together. It's all the same thing. It's only when we get down into the details that where we get lost and think that things are separate disciplines. They really are all interconnected. And of course, in my work, I think it's that materialization of information that shows the interconnectedness. And I'd like to talk about something real quick about again, how this model fits into different scenarios. Let's take the human brain, for example. Now, you'll notice in my interviews and hearing me talk, I very rarely talk about the human mind. And I very rarely talk about the human consciousness. And I very rarely talk about the human imagination. Because for me, all of those are characteristics of the physical human brain. The physical brain is really the starting point that manifests all these other things. And then when we look at it that way, when we look at imagination, that people think, oh, gee, that's just your imagination. Well, what does that mean? What does just your imagination mean? When you look at it from the idea, or from the perspective of the physical brain has a capability within it that images. It has an imaging faculty inside of it. So the imagination isn't, quote unquote, just your imagination. It's a characteristic of the physical structure in which it is sustained. So when we begin to look at it that way, things really begin to start drawing together and getting connected, and we can understand that, gee, the imagination isn't just the imagination. It is an imaging chamber, so to speak. Now, if we take it a step further and take a look at all the things that are around you, wherever everybody is in the listening audience, look around you. Look at your computer. Look at the telephone. Look at the table. Look at the chair you're standing or you're sitting on. The very clothes that you're wearing all began in an image. And that human brain had the capability of taking that information and materializing it into physical reality.
Exactly.
Because these things don't occur in nature without human agency. They just don't occur. So when we start looking at that materialization of information in the physical reality, and everywhere we look in reality, it begins to join everything together in the same kind of a mechanism. So the imagination is far more than just the imagination.
I want to shift where we're heading because I want to go back to the idea of the wormhole event horizon concept. When I hear you guys talk about it, I keep envisioning kind of like this movie screen with this action happening on the screen almost in a two-dimensional way. But is what you're saying is that they utilize this wormhole event and come through it, and that's why people experience things like scratches or being pushed or being touched?
Actually, no. That's the manifestation of pure energy. What the holographic imagery is it's actually a three-dimensional projection. So it literally could look like a physical person standing there, and often does. It's not two-dimensional. It is more like when I say screen, it's just a figure of speech. It's more like an area, a three-dimensional space. It's actually more than three-dimensional because there's actually at least 3 dimensions of time involved with it. But it creates like this cube of projection area, and it creates a hologram. And a hologram is three-dimensional. At least it visually appears to be three-dimensional.
Okay, but if it's three-dimensional, then how do you explain, the touching and the scratching and the pushing and the other things that, and the poltergeist activity that is often associated with...
You're starting to mix apples and oranges here. That's a different type of energy manifestation.
Well, yeah.
We're talking
then
one thing is a photonic emission. The imagery is a photonic emission, which is a very different kind of energy than, for example, a large scalar standing wave of pure energy that could knock you on your behind if it hits you, or split your skin, or tickle the back of your neck, or one of the aspects of your hair standing on end isn't really caused by anything other than the static field that's generated by the formation of the event in the first place. Emerging EMF can create sensations. It can stimulate your brain receptors to literally visualize or feel something that isn't there at all, but your brain is telling you that you're feeling it. there's all sorts of things that are going into effect here. Now, poltergeist activity is something else entirely. Poltergeist activity really hasn't been proven to have any connection to this paranormal event horizon. It's more of a manifestation of energy from a specific individual, almost like a psi energy occurring, and it generally occurs with young girls approaching the age or going through puberty. Statistically, I mean, Dr. William Roll, who was a good friend of mine, was probably the foremost expert on poltergeist activity, and it's a different kind of thing. It's more associated with the human condition than it is with something paranormal, although it manifests as a paranormal situation to people witnessing it. I think it's more of a normal manifestation of energy discharge based on chemical imbalance in the human body.
Anything, Tom?
Oh yeah, I disagree.
That's why I got you both here.
The reason being is because, again, I'm working under the paradigm that everything in the physical universe is the result of the same basic mechanism. And then things diversify and differentiate from that point. So, for example, let's talk about poltergeist activity for a moment. I mean, there have been extreme examples of things like large televisions, refrigerators, these kinds of things moving of themselves. Now, when you stop and take a look at the physics of it, you know, I don't know anyone that's even come remotely close to seeing or to demonstrating, even mathematically or even conceptually, how an individual human being can, A, generate a sufficient energy field, B, focus that field, and C, project that field into the presence of a refrigerator sufficient to pick up something of that mass and move it.
And yet there are people who did it, Tom. Look at Coral Castle, for example. Coral Castle was built entirely by hand by one man who weighed 90 pounds, and he lifted blocks that were over 70 tons. And
I understand. I'm not saying that it doesn't happen.
It's hard to understand how it happens.
I'm actually saying that these examples do happen, and these are very examples are the evidence that it is not an energy coming from an individual. Now, and again, I'm being very, very specific. I didn't just say that it's not coming from an individual. I just said that it's not an energy projection from an individual.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would agree it's a manipulation. It's a manipulation of energy.
Well, I would say something different. I don't think it's a manipulation of energy. I think it's a manipulation of Einstein's continuous spatial field. Let's think about this for a moment. According to my model, the bending of space that surrounds all objects it comes from a superphysical source, like Theodore Kaluza. What he concluded was that gravity itself was non-local. So let's take a model, for example, and see what I'm talking about. Let's take a table, and imagine this table has no glass top or wooden top. Instead, what it has a frame, and stretched across it is a flexible membrane like a rubber sheet. And let's say, furthermore, let's take a softball, stick it on that rubber sheet. And, of course, we know the rubber membrane across the mouth of the bowl was one of Einstein's favorite thought experiments. Now, when we place that that baseball or that softball on that rubber sheet, it depresses the space around it. Right. So here we have a depression of space-time that is curved around the physical object, just like the thought experiment Einstein talked about with the marble on the rubber sheet. Now, let's talk about moving it in a conventional way. And that would be we could take our hand and move this object, this baseball. We can roll it, let's say, a foot to the left. Now, as we roll it, the bending of space will follow it, so that space continues to bend around that object and flattens out as that object leaves that particular area that it was in.
When you have
But
frame
we
drag.
also are looking at all the energy that's being exerted, not only the physical force of the hand pushing it, but the actual energy from which the hand is made from. People forget that. You know, E equals MC squared. If you converted just your single arm into energy, it would be like a nuclear blast. You would blow up. So many square miles around you would be instantly atomized by all the energy that is condensed in your hand. In order to apply that energy to that refrigerator, you would have to have a structure like a hand to house it and direct it. That's why I say that's not what's going on. What I say is this: I go to the Einsteinian side and say, okay, we've talked about the energy to move the ball. Now, let's imagine underneath the fabric where we can't see. Let's imagine that's that area that I'm talking about is superphysical, is beyond the physical. And let's say that what I'm talking about is that the bends of space-time can be created from outside of space-time. So let's reach our imaginary hand underneath the table and take a pinch of space-time in front of the ball and pull it down and create a pocket. Suddenly, the ball magically rolls by itself into the depression without any exerted energy in the physical end of space-time. It just moves. If you were able to move the space that surrounds an object, you could manipulate it as easily as somebody runs a finger across a touch screen on a tablet. And so that's why we can see these large objects move of themselves without any visible or measurable energetic flow or source or concentration that would be sufficient to move a refrigerator. And I believe further that if UFOs are alien crafts, that the intelligence that's created them have discovered the physics of what I'm just talking about and have designed technology that exploits these capabilities.
Well,
Very
I'm glad you
possible.
brought up that topic because I was going to go there with you guys. At the Paradigm Symposium, I was talking to a bunch of people, and in one of the conversations, my good friend Micah Hanks, who's a...
Hey, Micah!
So you all friends with Micah? So then you know Micah and his little theoretical self. I almost thought of having him join the conversation. I'm like, no, too complicated. But one of the things that he threw out, which made me immediately think of you guys, was talking about this wormhole phenomena, bridging phenomena, that he was commenting not about ghosts per se, but about interdimensional, quote unquote, beings that fall into the UFO category. What do you guys think about that concept? And could what we be experiencing as ghosts actually be hanging out with those extraterrestrials?
Well,
if that makes sense in a very weird and vague way.
To me, the way I've been taught, multiple dimensions tend to manifest themselves at the subatomic level. So I have a problem with the terminology, and I think it's actually a confused terminology. I think when people think of multidimensional, they're not necessarily thinking so much of multidimensional, but another reality. And
they use interdimensional, but I mean, I think you get
reality.
the gist of where I'm trying to go with my question. It's probably my terminology, not their terminology.
Right. But certainly, let's call it an alternative reality, for clarity speaking. And obviously, there's probably many layers of alternate realities. In fact, if you buy into some of the theories in physics, for example, the many worlds theory by Hugh Everett III, which I don't particularly buy into because it implies that there is an endless supply of energy and matter that can be manipulated based on a person's decision. I don't really buy into that because I have issues with an infinite source of anything. But certainly there has to be multiple layers of reality, and particularly if you deal in the concepts of how time works. For example, the problem with time travel is that we wouldn't necessarily travel to another place in our timeline. We would probably jump to an adjacent timeline to another place in which everything is like it is here, but someone else altered the timeline, so it's a completely different timeline. And that would avoid the whole go back in time and kill your grandfather, and then therefore you didn't exist and couldn't have killed your grandfather type of thing. You know? But certainly the concept of alternative realities is a very real one, and I think it's a very tangible one. But again, I think it's kind of like, I look at it like a television broadcast. Inside of that carrier wave, there are many subcarrier waves, and each subcarrier wave is carrying its own batch of information. Those subcarriers have no concept that there are other subcarriers in the same information conduit as they are in. They're oblivious to it, and they don't interfere with each other. Only under certain conditions does interference occur. And I think that's a very good explanation for what we're seeing. I think that in certain circumstances, interference occurs, and when interference occurs, there is a transference of energy and matter.
My turn?
Stop. Your turn.
All right.
There is dead air. Your turn.
All right. Well, one of the things that David said, I can't agree more strongly with, and it's something that has contributed to our confusion. I don't blame anybody in particular because we've inherited it through our common vernacular. This idea of other quote-unquote dimensions or higher dimensions or interdimensional. And the problem with that is dimensions are a description of physical reality. In other words, we're talking again about height, width, depth, and time. So if you talk about another dimension, you would have to be talking about a projection of physical reality in which something physical can be sustained. And I believe that physical reality can only be sustained in the four dimensions that we know. This idea of higher dimensions is one of these mental paradigms that confuses people and causes so many people over so much time to have their reasoning travel down dead ends because there's nothing there. What David talked about as alternate reality, and what I might talk about as another aspect of reality, is much more accurate because then it's not tied to physical dimensionalism. It allows itself to exist higher than that. When we talk about the aliens and that type of thing, according to my model, information exists independently of its materialization. In other words, everything that we see that's materialized in the physical world, in the physical universe, has a collection of information outside of the physical universe from where this is materialized. If you destroyed the materialization, the information would still be there. And if everything in the universe has a wave function, which is what we have come to understand, everything ultimately emerges as a form of frequency and vibration. It must be directional. And follow what I'm saying. If my model is accurate, then there is an influence. I don't want to call it a force because a force is physical. An influence that combines with this information to materialize in physical reality. Picture it something like the biblical concept of formless matter. It wasn't material, it was formless. It was some sort of a substance. And then God spoke the information light. And then it materialized, it combined with that substance to create physical reality. like the Oriental concept of Wu-Li, form and substance. The snowflake, its ice, its water content is its substance, and the crystalline shape is its form. If it is directional, and anything that manifests itself as a projected wave, as a compression wave, would be directional, then I believe that polarity can be reversed. So, for example, we have a fully materialized alien in a spaceship on a planet in another section of the galaxy. And if we would reverse the polarity of that materializing process, which would in turn collapse the space-time bubble surrounding that object would literally disappear out of our space. While it was dematerializing, while it was being reversed, so to speak, we would see things like it would begin to float. It would become transparent. It would do the very same kinds of things that you would see in a haunted house, like with an apparition. It could travel through other solid objects without affecting it, because its physical presence, as I talk about, has been so greatly reduced that it no longer is being affected all that much by light. Light is passing through it. Gravitational fields no longer have the same effect on it. Now, once it was completely withdrawn from our physical universe, so that the fabric of space-time where it was has become flat again, it would disappear. It would be dematerialized. It would be gone. And yet the information from which it was assembled still exists. And so just like the remote viewer who receives information from another source over space-time and down into his or her brain, that information could be projected to the correct frequency resonance of a location in space-time elsewhere in the galaxy. An artificial bubble of space-time can be formed and expanded there. The information would drop down, and then those creatures and their ships would literally be teleported into our local space. That's how I think it works.
I have to tell you, you're kind of like wrecking my little image of what the other side is like. I've always, and I don't want you to laugh at me or anyone listening, I've always had this image, and think of like Star Trek, because they've done episodes and they take like some kind of mojo drink, and the next thing you know is they're talking normal, and everybody else on the ship is like moving in slow motion, so slow that nobody can see, you know, from their perspective. But then when they go to the perspective of the crew, the captain and Mr. Spock are invisible. And I've always had the impression that that's kind of what happens, so that, you know, when you die, you know, you still kind of have a body, but it's more of an energy body, which, you know, could go to heaven or go wherever it wants to go. But it's not sounding like that's what you guys are finding in science.
Well, I think that, you know, if you thought about what I just said, with sufficient technology, with the right understanding, when the, you know, Captain Kirk drank that drink or whatever, that kind of effect might still be observed. It's just that the person who was quote unquote accelerated isn't necessarily cohabitating space-time with the other people and objects. I found something very interesting. I normally take kind of a neutral position when it comes to the alien abduction thing. You know, all I say is that according to my model, it's possible. But I don't have any personal evidence to render an opinion on it one way or the other. I was on a radio show. This wasn't too long ago, Dr. Rita. It was a couple months ago, where this person was called in. He's apparently a regular caller on this show. It might have been Ohio Exopolitics. It might have been that show. But this person was from Pennsylvania, and he's talking about this experience of being abducted. And I'm listening, okay, I understand what you're saying, this and that. And then he said something very, very strange. He started talking about how he experienced him sitting at his computer, and then what it looked like around him, and then how he would kind of flow or merge into these other surroundings where suddenly he was in this craft, and some of the things looked ethereal in the craft, and some of them were quite solid. And the process he described almost stood my hair on end, because what he was describing, experiencing, would be very, very consistent with what someone would experience according to the model that I just described. It actually shook me up when he was talking about it.
Interesting. Okay, going to shift topics here again for a second. And David, this one's directed to you, although Tom, you obviously can add in. What kind of evidence, so let's talk about some data here. Or equipment, what kind of evidence have you found to support these theories?
Well, that's an interesting question. One of the
I know you're all about evidence.
One of the devices that I designed is I call it an EMF quadrilator, and essentially it has 4 very, very directional EMF sensors. We generally will place these in the perimeter of a room. The information from those sensors goes into a digital signal processor, which gives me total control over the frequencies that we're picking up. And what this allows me to do is to notch filter out certain undesirable frequencies that may be causing interference, such as 60 cycles from the power in the home and that sort of thing. And literally I'm able to look at the noise floor, the EMF noise floor of a very localized environment. What happens is I'm looking for something to appear above that noise floor, and by utilizing the signal strength in each one of the sensors, I can physically place the location of that emerging frequency inside the room. Once I can establish that emergence point, then it's very easy to put a battery of instrumentation in that area and begin recording exactly everything that's going on in there. For example, we will start looking for barometric pressure drops, temperature fluctuations, drops in relative humidity, elevated levels of static energy, elevated levels of specific low-frequency EMF. EVPs will form in this area, will emerge in this area. Gamma radiation bursts begin occurring. Ionization levels begin to go off the charts. Other things that occur, time fluctuations, gravity fluctuations, and we're measuring all of these specific parameters in a very localized area where they seem to be running amok. And that alone has allowed us to kind of map out this area of effect. What's interesting is that if you are standing just outside of that area of effect, your instrumentation reveals nothing. So it's like it's not even happening. So this lends to the fact that you may have gone to an investigation and never found anything at all, and yet there was probably activity going on that you missed because you weren't at the right place at the right time. What the quadrilator allows us to do is to take the guesswork out of where it's occurring and literally find it in a specific location within the scanned area and then concentrate the instrumentation in that area. So a lot of the environmental changes that are occurring, we've been able to document because we're running these sensory feeds into a data logger. And what a data logger allows us to do is to put multiple channels of information in real time, creating a real-time document that shows all of the fluctuations and changes in a real-time spectrum, so that you can take these time charts, and then you can correlate it to physical experiences, to other reported experiences that are occurring that are of a non-tangible nature. For example, psychological responses, emotional responses, personal experiences. if we can correlate the time of each experience to specific data changes or alterations, then we can make a correlation between a physical person's experience as well as to the actual environmental changes occurring around them. And then hopefully we can tie that together and try to determine what exactly is going on. Why did the person feel total sadness all of a sudden? Why did the person feel, a total fear impulse and a desire to flee? And it may be because there was a very, very high-level emerging EMF signal in like 11 or 12 hertz frequency range. And that would trigger an emotional response, with the body, based on the research that Dr. Michael Persinger has been doing with artificially creating events into people's minds by stimulating different parts of the brains with different, frequencies. So we're looking at not just what's happening to the environment, we're also looking at how that environmental change is affecting the human experience. And the human element is definitely a factor in it. And I'll just say, for example, we normally set equipment up and then we leave the room and we let the equipment log and sit there and continue to run for a specific period of time before checking up on it. Now we have a way that it notifies us with an email if something starts to form, and we can rush back in and then, react to it. But any time that we've been out of the room, we have a level of readings, and when we enter back into the room, those readings alter, which are reflecting that we as human beings also change the environment merely by our presence. And we change the environment in measurable ways. So we can't rule out the human factor in any of these experiments, particularly since, controlling an experiment in the field of environmental research is very difficult. This is a situation that allows us to implicate controls in a non-direct manner. In other words, we can say, this is the non-human condition, this is the introduction of human into the condition, and there's a differential of the data. So it's kind of fascinating to see how that changes as we add different aspects or take away different aspects to the environment. But we're measuring all of these things, and again, we're looking in science for what would explain these pockets of anomalous readings, and there's only a couple of things that will do it. And, Tom has hit upon one version, and I've hit upon the only other one. So, either one of us is right or both of us are right to some degree, but the important thing is that both of us can predict certain conditions that occur in the environment, and they do, and we can measure them. And I think that's the takeaway from the whole thing.
And Tom, I'm going to come to you in 1 second. I want to ask David a little teeny follow-up, or hopefully a little teeny follow-up question. Have you had, there's obviously what happens in a haunted location, but have you ever just, set up your equipment in your living room and had any anomalous activity happen there? Or, where I'm going with that?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, my old lab was a Faraday cage. The entire room was a Faraday cage. It was completely isolated from any external EMF, and absolutely, there's nothing haunted going on in my house at any time, and it was certainly nothing going on haunted in my basement. And yet these wormholes are continuing to form whether there is activity associated with them or not. And that tends to make me think that it's a total natural occurrence, or it's a natural function that is occurring, and not all of them are associated with haunted activity. However, I think that because these things open up all over the place all the time, I think haunted activity utilizes that aspect of it to have an interface with our reality.
All right, you got my mind going. What would be interesting, and I'm just going to make this comment, I'm going to move to Tom, is, when you were there and your equipment was going off, if there was something that went through your mind, if there was some information that you were receiving because maybe somebody was thinking about you or something like that, and it was creating one of these little wormholes, those energy cords from people, because I would think they would operate in a similar way, and have a similar action, from the ghost world as to people. I'm just going to leave that with a comment, and I'm just going to turn to Tom.
Okay. David, what's it called again? A quadrilator? Or?
It's just, I call it a wormhole detector, but the official term for it is a EMF quadrilator. In other words, instead of a triangulation method, we're using a quadrangulation method. where instead of 3 sensors, we're using 4. And the reason we're
Okay.
doing that because it increases the sensitivity and the accuracy of being able to place the event horizon in a specific location in the room. I started out with 3 sensors, and we had some difficulty, and those difficulties were cleared up by using 4 sensors.
There you go. Okay. Well, first, to answer your question, Dr. Rita, first I want to make a comment, and then I'll talk about, as far as results, experimental, that type of thing with your question. The first thing that I want to do is, if there are any paranormal investigators that are listening, I want you to go back after the show and play this particular segment of David that he just talked about over again and listen to it. This quadulator that he's talking about is a quantum leap in paranormal research. It is so far beyond anything that has been done up to this point, and so significant that if you can imagine me standing on a mountaintop and screaming at the top of my lungs, picture that. Understand this equipment. Find out about this equipment. Apply and utilize this equipment that David has developed. It will do 2 things. Number one, it actually sets up a valid, controlled, experimental laboratory environment at a remote location. Investigators talk about doing things scientifically, but really, from a scientific relevance, you have to have a baseline for your experimental findings to be relevant. People, and I don't mean to be disrespectful, I'm just trying to get your attention when I say it this way. People running around haunted houses with EMF meters and thermal imaging cameras, and is no more experimentally relevant than a tourist running around the countryside with a sophisticated digital movie camera. They're not conducting science. They're using a scientific instrument to gather data, but they're not conducting science. David's work is what will help you conduct real science. When you understand this equipment, and I understand it's not all that expensive to make, David, am I correct?
Right.
You will understand not only how to conduct science, real science in these sites, but that your results will be experimentally relevant. I mean, what David's doing with this equipment compared to what most people, investigators, are doing is the difference between flying a jet and flying a kite. And I'm not trying to be sarcastic with that. I'm just trying to emphasize how important that is. As far as to answer your question, I'm a theorist. Like Einstein never conducted any of his own experiments. He sat down and laid out the theory. So when it comes to results or experimental findings or this type of thing, the importance of my theory are the predictions it makes and the anomalies that it describes and answers. For example, we were talking about the predictions my model makes that about the different manifestations that would occur inside of a haunted house. It predicts the time dilations and the gravity fluctuations, barometric pressure, changes in temperature, all those things that David has found. But what it also does is a few other things. For example, one of the problems, the fundamental problems that has plagued our physics is reckoning with gravity. Every time we approach gravity and the bending of space as a conventional force, like the predominant view in physics is, that it's a force like electromagnetism or the strong and weak nuclear forces, we always get thwarted. We never are able to work it out. Gravity is what holds us from reconciling quantum physics with relativity. Gravity is what stopped Einstein from being able to work out his unified field theory equations. He could not project gravity mathematically throughout 4 dimensions on a quantum level. Our standard model of the universe that physicists use to describe the particles and all their interactions in the cosmos, capital S, capital M, standard model, does not have an expression for gravity. Most lay people don't know that. It works very well without an expression for gravity. And one of the things that my theory puts forth is that gravity is not a force like electromagnetism or the strong and weak nuclear forces. Therefore, there's no such thing as a graviton. And that is why we can't find a particle of gravity, because my model says that a particle of gravity doesn't exist. That the bending of space is a cause for gravity in matter, not matter being a cause of gravity in space. It eliminates the physical particulate requirement. Another prediction that it makes, one of the puzzles of astrophysicists, is that they can't explain how the Big Bang, the first moments of the Big Bang, accelerated at such a great rate that it's beyond anything that we can calculate, even past dark matter or dark energy. They don't understand how that early cosmic expansion took place. My model predicts that the reason why that looks that way is that the first moments of the Big Bang were superluminal, that they existed superphysically. And when physical reality began to materialize, we were actually looking at a giant ring rather than a nucleus, almost like a smoke ring appearing. And that's why I call the beginning of the universe the Big Puff. I don't call it the Big Bang. Another thing that it predicts is if we go back, and nobody's looked for this yet, if we go back to the outer stretches of the universe where we're seeing light come to us from distant time, from maybe billions of years in the past, that it takes that light to travel to us. When we examine that part of the universe, we are going to find that the percentage of gravitational lensing to visible mass is smaller than it is as it gets closer to us. The closer our observations are to our local space, the greater the gravitational lensing will be observed proportionate to the visible mass. It says that there really is no such thing as dark matter or dark energy, that all of this can be explained by a progressing expansion of space-time and the materialization of information within. So these are some of the predictions that my theory makes that have still yet to be looked into by mainstream physics and verified.
Yeah, you may have to modify that. They're very close on dark matter right now, buddy.
I know, but, we also had that survey, David, earlier this past year, where after I think it was 2 or 3 years, where they surveyed our local space, with the solar system and the stars in our immediate vicinity, that they found no evidence for dark matter, that they were able to account for all the observations, and there was no place left for a proportion of dark matter, even a tiny proportion, let alone something that would represent 90 or 95% of the universe.
Yeah,
well, I don't want to interrupt your, dark conversation. They can't find it because it's dark. It's ghostly matter. They should call it ghost matter.
That Fermilab is operating right now, Rita, that if it's out there, this camera will find it. They just started running it last week. So I'm watching this very closely to see what they come up with.
I just know that our time-space continuum is running very close. So, Dave? What's next up for you? Your book, which we didn't mention at all. Webpage. Let's kind of give you a chance to wrap up.
Oh, sure. My book, Paranormal Technology: Understanding the Science of Ghost Hunting, is starting its 3rd year in its existence. You can get information about it at my website, www.spinvestigations.org. I do have a new book in the works that was co-written with Robbie Lunt, which is more of a personal experience story from something that took place back in 1985 that was of demonic nature. And it's a good story. A lot of people probably won't believe it. There's not a word of science anywhere in it. it's just a good story, and it was true for the people that were involved in it. And I'll leave it at that. We're looking for a publisher right now. Hopefully it will be out by Christmas. We'll see. And I'm pretty much cooling it through the holidays. I've been doing a lot of traveling this year, and I need to be staying close to home and getting some stuff done around here more. And my first book show is next year in March, when I'll be going to Texas for the Paranormal Unity Festival.
Ooh, we'll get to hang out again.
Yeah.
Yay. Unless it's outside camping in the rain and the freezing cold, which...
No, I think they learned their lesson on that one.
It's like, I so don't do cold. And so Thomas was talking about your equipment. Is that equipment available on your website too?
Well, I don't sell anything.
It's
what
secret
I do
equipment.
is I outline the build process, because everything that I build is prototypical. In other words, it's not built to be sold or packaged. It's designed to be assembled from off-the-shelf items that anybody can buy and put together and arrange. So they're very simple setups based on selecting the right type of equipment and mating it together and making it work. So I am in the process of refining the online. For example, I have a whole section on how I built the sensors. I'll have a whole section on how I assembled the device and that sort of thing. And the idea is for other people to be able to duplicate it.
Okay, and I'm seeing that I'm getting written here, which means our time's almost up. Thomas.
Okay. I'm continuing to try to get the word out on my work. I need to find a few individuals to help me, of course. I need to find a physicist versed in relativity and Kaluza-Klein theory. I need to find a mathematician versed in theoretical physics. And I need to find an engineer. I need to find funding. And that's what I'm still working on. I've got a couple books in the works, but I'm not ready to announce anything yet. And that's... Oh, and David and I need to get together at some point and come up with a unified model for what we're talking about and go from there.
Absolutely.
Okay, so with the new network, I don't have my little show clock anymore, so I was flying a little blind, and they just told me I have like 10 minutes left. And so I received a quote. I'm in a time warp, different dimension than everyone, and I'm just wormholing into the network.
There you go.
Anyway,
well,
there was a question that came up that said, would like to know what you think about ghost boxes. It is from our engineer, Jamie. He has a ghost box. Would like to know your opinion.
Well, I think it's great if you want to listen to bits and pieces of every radio announcer and talk radio show host on the AM radio band, because that's essentially what you're doing with it. The notion that ghosts sprout a AM broadcast transmitter, modulate their voice somehow on that carrier wave, and then specifically send it to the exact random location that your ghost box happens to be randomly tuning to is pretty far-fetched. What's really happening there is you're building words with phonetics, depending on the scan rate that you set up. And it's basically invalid as any kind of evidence scientifically, because it's so easily dismissed. The problem with these devices is there's no switch on it that says normal, paranormal. With literally thousands of potential normal sources for what you're getting, and your only judge on whether it's relative or not is the content, which, by the way, 53% of the time with the English language will make sense and be relevant to what your subject matter is. And it's useless as evidence. So if it's, it's like the Magic 8 Ball. It's a party game, a parlor game, a gadget. And if you're going to spend that kind of money to build, a device such as that, I would recommend taking that money and building a device that produces evidence that is viable and usable by the scientific community. While it's a great parlor game, it's relatively useless for evidence.
Personally, I love my Magic 8 Ball. Okay.
I use mine all the time.
Well, people laugh at me because it's like, I only buy Magic 8 Balls that want to come home with me. And they're like, well, how do you do that? It's like, well, I go to the store and I ask the Magic 8 Ball, do you want to come home with me? And if it says no, I'm not buying it.
That's exactly right.
Okay. Tom, do you have any experience with Frank's boxes?
Well, the way I look at it is this, and people need to understand, I myself am not a paranormal investigator. Paranormal is a relevant body of data that plays into the theory of how the universe is put together. But I would side with David on this very strongly with these voice boxes, again, because my interest is finding out how the universe is put together so that these things can occur. And as a result, that piece of equipment is just too open-ended and too difficult to really narrow down to make it a scientifically effective device. It is definitely a device that's very popular with those who are interested in the paranormal because of the thrill or the experience of it, but it is of dubious value from a scientific perspective.
Okay.
I hate the word.
Well, I'm
thing.
like going, okay, I'm a little vague on time. Anyway.
You got about 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Well, I have like my computer clock, and I have another clock, and I have a watch, and they all have different times, and so I'm a little, I'm a little vortexy here. Very quickly, David, you were talking about your experience. Maybe you both said that you've had like ghost experiences, so maybe you could tell a quick story.
Oh, sure. I mean, when I was 6 years old, my grandfather came and said goodbye to me in the middle of the night when I was sleeping, and I woke up the next morning and told my mom, and she gave me a real funny look and said my grandfather had died that night. So that was my very first personal experience that I had no concept as a 6-year-old what it meant. But it was something that stuck in my mind for the rest of my life. And then in another situation, I had an experience the night that I graduated from high school. We all went to a haunted house, and I watched my date stand on the front porch, and suddenly she was in slow motion, and her hair was like blowing off to one side, very, very slow, like time was moving so much slower than normal, and it was a physical sensation, and I couldn't explain that as well. Now I know that she was in a time anomaly, and we were witnessing a time anomaly taking place, which is, pretty expected if you have some type of Einstein-Rosen bridge activity occurring. Time is going to alter in the way it flows. So those are a couple of quick ones that come to mind.
How about you, Tom?
Well, I don't have any ghost stories to tell. I've never seen an apparition, never heard a disembodied voice, never witnessed any of these things that occur in haunted houses. I've had some parapsychological experiences, but, what I do is I accept the body of data, accumulated data, as being valid. I believe that one only has to demonstrate one genuine apparition to conclude that these things actually occur. The fact that you could record 1,000 of them or 10,000 or 100,000 of them doesn't necessarily make it more certain. Only needs to happen once. And that means its very happening would have to be consistent with the way the universe is put together. Otherwise, it couldn't happen.
Exactly. In order to prove the concept that crows are white, it just takes one white crow.
There you go. You only need one rock falling out of the sky and hitting the ground to confirm that meteorites indeed do exist. And unlike what the Paris Academy of Science declared in the late 1800s, there are indeed rocks in the sky.
But then again, there are those people that see the white crow and say, it was your imagination, just like the ghosts.
Yeah, but according to me, imagination is physical and real.
Exactly. What you can imagine, you can produce. You can reality.
But that's interesting because it brings in the whole concept of the law of attraction, and what your intention is and what you put out into the universe is what you bring back to you, both good and bad.
Exactly. Karma.
Well, I don't know about
the universe
karma
is a system.
Yeah.
It behaves according to laws and principles. We don't all understand them all, but it has a set of fixed laws and principles. No subset of a greater system can operate in a way that's contrary to or outside of the laws of the greater system in which it is a part or a subset. We human beings and our brains are a subset of the physical universe. Therefore, because of our very nature, we can say with an absolute certainty that intelligence, life, and creativity are built into the very laws and principles that govern the greater universe.
Oh, there's the music. Guys, thanks for being on the show today, and happy Halloween to both of you.
Absolutely. My favorite holiday.
Your favorite holiday. And I'm sure I will talk to you both soon. David, looking forward to seeing you in Texas when you're here next, because I'm sure we'll run into each other. Okay?
All righty. Sounds good.
All right. Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks for having us.
That was David, www.spininvestigations.org, and Thomas Fusco, his webpage is www.cosmicveil.com. And next week, we're going to be speaking to Father Sebastian, talking about the